Good morning. I'm Nitasha Buldeo and welcome to Wellbeing Webinar. Today we have a very interesting topic. We're discussing paganism, pagan ritual, and how to use pagan ritual to bring magic and meaning into the everyday. Now, while many of us are intrigued by paganism, possibly a little wary of paganism, I'm sure we'd all love to find out more. So our guest today is really interesting. We have Dr. Charmaine Sonnex from Buckingham University. And she's going to talk us through what paganism is. She's going to tell us a little bit about pagan ritual, pagan spells, and she's also going to talk about what paganism is not. So excited to have you join us today, Charmaine. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is give Dr. Sonnex a chance to introduce herself.
Hello, yeah, I'm Dr. Charmaine Sonnex. At the moment, I am a psychology lecturer at the University of Buckingham. I also work as a committee member of the transpersonal section of the British Psychological Society. The sort of research that I tend to do focuses on transpersonal psychology, which is the psychology of kind of spiritual and mystical experiences and the transformative elements of those. I'm also very interested in the psychology of religion and spirituality. And the majority of my work has a real focus on modern pagan practices.
So what excited me about getting Dr. Sonnex on our webinar is a paper that she wrote for the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, focused on pagan rituals and bringing more personal and esoteric meaning into life. Maybe we should start by explaining paganism. Yeah.
Sure. So modern paganism is essentially, it's an umbrella term for a lot of different paths or traditions that are essentially nature worship. They are mostly influenced by kind of pre-Christian native practices of most often Europe, but also a lot of people's practices are inspired by folk practices of lots of places. It's often there's that inspiration from folk practices that's woven in with the nature worship.
So tell us a little bit about nature worship. And what does it entail? Because it seems to be what differentiates paganism from other religions.
Sure. It's, I think one of the key ways of understanding how that works and how important it is when we consider deity in paganism. The gods and goddesses are avatars of various different elements of nature. So most commonly it's a moon goddess and a sun god. And the various days of importance, which tend to be referred to as the wheel of the year, are celebrated because they are key points in the year when things are happening either astronomically with the sun and the moon or agriculturally. So things like harvests, the beginning of spring, these sorts of things. So we celebrate what's happening then in nature, and also that's reflected in a story of the god and the goddess and the progress that they are making as well, which is often a cyclical one.
Okay.
So if we have a look at the wheel of the year that the majority of pagans tend to follow, we start with Yule, which is usually around the 21st of December. This is the winter solstice. So this is the day when the days start to get longer from that point. The nights are at their darkest at that point. And so in the story of the god and the goddess, this tends to be when the god is born or reborn, because he is the sun and the days start getting longer, so sun starts coming back. So there's usually lots of, you know, this is a reason to celebrate because the days have been getting longer and longer for months. You know, traditionally when we were much more agriculturally based, it would be a time when there was no real food around, that, you know, you were living on whatever you'd stored from the summer. It would have been really dark, it would have been kind of miserable, and then it's like suddenly it's going to get better now. So yeah, lots of celebrations, fire, candles, feasting, all that good stuff. Very similar to other religious celebrations that happen around that time of year. And then the next one that we have is around February the 1st. This is sometimes referred to as Imbolc. And this is celebrating kind of those first stirrings of spring. It's not necessarily the official start of spring, but it's those first stirrings. So when it starts to get a bit warmer, we maybe start to see the first few little buds peeking up through the ground. And this is often seen for some people as the recovery of the goddess after birth, because this is a kind of cyclical thing. The goddess will give birth to the god who then becomes her consort. Next we have Ostara. Some of these names vary. Some people tend to use the Celtic names, some people use other names. And this is spring equinox. So this tends to be around March 21st. So this is, an equinox is when the days and the nights are of equal length. So it's often about balance. And so this is that kind of celebration, and it's often kind of the real beginnings of spring. We're really seeing this happen now. Next, around April 30th, May the 1st, we have Beltane. And this is really when we're kind of going into the beginning of summer. We're really seeing all of that growth happening. And in the story of the god and the goddess, this is their kind of joining. The god at this point has grown into a man and becomes the consort of the goddess. And then we have summer solstice, sometimes known as Litha. So this is around June 21st. So this is the longest day. So this is all about kind of the height of summer. You know, everything's in full bloom. It's all kind of fantastic. So just celebrating that, really, that everything's in full bloom, and it's all great the way it tends to be in summer. Then next we have Lunasa, around August the 1st. So this is also sometimes called Lammas. This is kind of the first harvest. So we're beginning, you know, again, agriculturally, this is when the first harvest starts to come in. So this would be kind of reaping what we're sowing, both figuratively and literally. Then we have Mabon, or autumn equinox. So again, days and nights being equal. This is that kind of balance. And so this is the kind of the start of the really noticeable decline of the god now at this point. And then October 31st, we have Samhain, also known as Halloween. And this marks the kind of death of the god, or the start of his journey into the underworld to be reborn. And so this is, you know, you might have heard the time, it's when the veil between the worlds is thinnest. This is a celebration of kind of our ancestors, of people who've passed. And it's the start of turning inward as well. So we see from the perspective of the goddess, this is when the goddess maybe becomes more the kind of crone figure is dominant. You know, she's wise, but she also kind of inhabits the dark. Mm-hmm. And so this is a time when you might start doing more kind of self-reflection and self-work. So as the goddess becomes the crone, as the god goes into the underworld, so we can start kind of maybe going into our own subconscious and working on those sorts of things. And then it starts all over again at Yule.
Brilliant. Now, I love how in your paper you talked about, or you brought in Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I just, you know, explain what you mean by eudaimonia and how this links in with paganism, pagan rituals, and personal development, because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
Sure. Mm-hmm. So there's been a trend in recent years in psychology, especially, to have a look at well-being or happiness in more kind of critical terms. And so looking at actually what is well-being. And the consensus at the moment is there are kind of two flavors of well-being. There's hedonia and eudaimonia. So hedonia is what we may commonly think of as happiness. It's, you know, basically the presence of positive affect, which is the kind of psychology term for feelings or emotions, and maybe the absence of negative emotions, and very kind of straightforward. Eudaimonia, on the other hand, is more about kind of living authentically and living with meaning. Mm-hmm. And so it's more about that, and it comes from Aristotle's concept of the daimon, which is basically our highest self, our highest potential. So he said that to be living a good life, we should be trying to live in accordance with our highest potential and being all that we can be. And so eudaimonia is around kind of a well-being that comes with doing what you were meant to do and kind of following that and fulfilling your potential.
Yeah, a few interesting terms that you mentioned. Hedonia, right? Mm-hmm. So basically, that would translate into what we think of as a hedonistic life. Would you say that, or is
yes, that yeah? I think the term hedonistic, I think, comes with some value judgments attached to it. And I think it's more it's about feeling good. It's not necessarily about living a meaningful life. Yeah. And we understand, you know, in psychology, the understanding is that we need both. We need both hedonia and eudaimonia to really, truly be happy. Because I think it's really easy to kind of get all overly virtuous and be like, oh no, you don't have to, it's not about just feeling good, that's fleeting. Well, yes and no, it's also necessary. So it's about kind of striking a balance, I think. But I'm particularly interested in how we can actually achieve eudaimonia. How can we, you know, discover what our true potential is and then actually live in a way that helps us to fulfill that? Because if you're doing something meaningful with your life, I do think that you know, that can be really helpful when times are tough. And it's, if everyone can live up to their full potential, then I think that would be a wonderful thing.
Now, what you've just said has so many questions buzzing in my head. But the one thing is, let's go back to daimon, which has become demon in modern.
I think so, but it is a different concept. So when Aristotle was talking about someone's daimon, it was about basically the kind of their higher self, who they could be if they were all that they could be. And so he said that that's what, to be living a virtuous and a good life, then we should actually be trying to live that way. You know, we should be trying to fulfill that potential. And there's similar sorts of ways of describing that in, you know, in more recent psychology theory. So, for example, Maslow, humanistic psychologist in the 60s, most well known for his hierarchy of needs, which people might be familiar with. It's kind of usually viewed as a triangle with levels, and these are kind of specific needs, and you have to fulfill each need before you can move on to the next one, until you get to a point known as self-actualization, and that's when you can work then on fulfilling your potential. It does actually go beyond that to SelfTranscendence as well, which is when you then try and help other people to fulfill their potential. And it's all about fulfilling our potential and living a meaningful life.
Yeah, I've often seen daimon translated as personal genius as well. Yeah, I'm not sure if you've come up with that.
I haven't, but I think that's quite a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, so it's about, so you'd say, this entire idea of eudaimonia is living by very personal standards, living to achieve your inner higher standards, and that is actually self-defined.
Yes, I think, yes, absolutely. It's your own personal potential, and what someone else may find meaningful may not be the same for you. So it's about finding what is that for you as an individual, and how can you live authentically to that.
So yes, and you've mentioned a few of the other psychologists who've alluded to a similar process in terms of living your highest potential. But what's so interesting about paganism is that it's very natural, and once you understand the basic concepts, it seems like it is self-driven. So while with the psychotherapeutic modalities, you do need a professional to help you along, but with paganism, it feels like this process becomes quite self-directed.
So paganism is very self-directed anyway. Although you may work in a group, which is often known as a coven, and perhaps you're receiving guidance that way. For a lot of people, they practice as solitary practitioners. They practice on their own. And for a lot of pagans, their first kind of forays into paganism were completely self-driven. They were self-taught. They were reading books and kind of taking what worked and running with that, and kind of discarding what didn't work. And that's very much an ethos of modern paganism now, is what works for you. But that kind of comes with the understanding that there is a lot of self-discovery and self-knowledge that comes with this. As I think with any kind of spiritual path that people are truly engaging in, that involves self-knowledge, that involves learning about yourself. And with pagan practices, because of the way that you're working, you really want to create an atmosphere that is quite immersive, that is liminal, which is a fancy way of saying it's kind of on a border. It's between two things, and the space that you work in as a pagan is often referred to as the space between worlds, between kind of the mundane and the sacred. And so to be able to really do that effectively, quite often you want to do what works for you, what's eliciting those feelings in you. And
so, it's quite interesting, because when you say, the space between the two worlds, so that's the two worlds. You're in that space between where you currently are and where you have the potential to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of kind of worlds that you can be between in that. You can take it in a very literal sense that you are in a space that is very sacred, that you've created for practicing. But for most people, they're creating that kind of in their living room, in a very mundane kind of place. So it can be that, but it also can be, as you say, it's kind of between where you are and your potential.
So maybe this is really, really simplistic, but from what I'm getting out of this is that paganism is about finding your sacred space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would say so. Especially in practice, it's about kind of what works for you, and working with that. That's not to say that you can't work with other people. Obviously, there are lots of people who work kind of in groups as well. But for personal practice, I would always say to people, it's what works for you. So, your understanding of a particular god or goddess, within reason, as long as it's not becoming kind of culturally appropriative, but your kind of understanding of that, how do you feel is the best way to interact with those deities? Or perhaps you don't work with deities at all. There are pagan atheists as well, who view the gods and the goddesses as archetypal figures within our unconscious that represent various different aspects of the human experience and the psyche. And so by engaging with those gods and goddesses, they're engaging with those different elements of their psyche. And those two views of the gods and the goddess are not mutually exclusive either. It could be that you see it both ways, that they are literal figures and archetypal figures. And so it becomes very much about working with that. But it is also about connection to others. It's not this kind of it's not an insular practice that is only about yourself. It is also very much about connecting with nature and with other people in your community as well. The concept of the kind of web of life where everything is interconnected. So we as humans are all interconnected. We are also interconnected to the world that we live in, to the trees, to the plants, to the oceans and the rivers and the winds and all of these things. We are all connected. And so magical or pagan ritual practices can be about re-establishing those connections as well, and really feeling part of a wider community, whether that's kind of a spiritual community, whether that's a global community. It's about re-establishing those connections as well.
I think so, you know, just to clarify it for me, is with paganism, it's more about the intention and the meaning that it brings to you than the spell of the ritual in isolation.
Yes, in a sense. So spells rituals workings will often have a kind of specific structure, which is that you start with kind of separating yourself from the mundane world. And we do this by creating a magic circle. That's how it tends to be done. So this is when you create a space to work in, because for pagans, the majority of pagans, there is not somewhere where they can go to practice. There isn't a kind of pagan church or mosque or synagogue. So it tends to happen in people's homes, in their gardens, if they're lucky enough not to be overlooked. Perhaps they know, like, somewhere out in nature, in woods or fields, where they're not going to be disturbed. So it starts with marking out the space, which is often a circle. And this can be done physically with things like a length of rope, a circle of stones, a circle of salt, something like that. And also it's done energetically through the use of tools like a magic wand or an athame, which is a magic knife. They're both tools that are used to direct energy. So a lot of the way that magic is understood to work is through energy and through visualizing to kind of control that energy. So practitioners will kind of mark the boundaries energetically as well as physically. And the next stage of that is to then sanctify that space. So you've separated it from normal everyday world. You would then sanctify it to kind of make it this holy, sacred place to work in. And so that kind of creates that space. And it's called magic circle, but it tends to be viewed as a bubble. And you're kind of creating this bubble that is outside of ordinary time and space, and it's sanctified. And it gives that feeling like you get when you walk into a place of worship. You know, I don't know if everybody has this experience, but kind of regardless of my own religious spiritual path, I find that when I go somewhere that is a temple, that is a place of worship, it has an atmosphere and it becomes a space of reverence. And so you're creating that same kind of atmosphere when you're casting a circle. So once that's been cast, then the ritual or the spell can begin. And this very much varies depending on what you're doing. So with spells for purpose, then this is about raising energy, whether that's through things like dance or chanting, imbuing it with a specific intention. So you always have to have that intention in your mind. You really have to be focused on what it is that you want to achieve. And that's why, again, having things like specific crystals, candle colors, incense, they all act as kind of reminders of what it is that you're focusing on. And then once you've kind of built that energy, you've imbued it with a purpose, you then send it out. What that looks like can vary. As I say, for some people it can be movement, it can be through dance. So there's something known as the spiral dance, where people will literally dance in a spiral, in a circle, until they reach a kind of crescendo, and there's almost a kind of physical release. It can be through candle magic, where you light a candle, you focus on the attention, and either you snuff it out yourself or it extinguishes, and that's kind of the energy sent.
As a psychologist, would you say that that liminal space is sort of an access to the subconscious, pre-conscious, is a way of letting go of those conscious limitations that we set by ourselves, for ourselves, on ourselves? Is liminal space about letting go and accessing our very own subconscious, preconscious, unconscious?
Yeah, absolutely. Any and all of those things, I think. Yeah, if we're, you know, we can't have access to that all the time. I just don't think you'd be able to, you wouldn't be able to function in the world. You know, our ordinary frame of consciousness, where we have, you know, where we're not necessarily aware of all the sorts of things that are going on inside of us, it's useful. You know, we are that way for a reason. But I do think that taking time away from that, of working in different states of consciousness, and I avoid the word altered when I'm talking about ritual, because I think that, you know, it's not necessarily a kind of trance state. It's not like when you're using psychedelics and accessing different states of consciousness. There, it's more ordinary than that, but not ordinary. And that is very beneficial. And the kind of state of consciousness that you tend to achieve, or what you're kind of aiming for in pagan ritual, is flow, which some people might be familiar with. Psychologist Csikszentmihalyi kind of coined the term flow, and it's essentially the kind of common understanding is when you're in the zone, when you're having that experience where you're doing something and you're so deeply engrossed in it, you don't have to think about it. It's all just kind of working. You lose all sense of time. You lose all sense of yourself. You are just doing the thing. And there are all sorts of benefits involved with achieving flow states. And that's essentially the state that you're in when you are doing kind of pagan ritual. And I think a lot of that is accessed through being in that liminal space. It makes it an awful lot easier to enter into flow.
So you'd say that the rituals, the purpose of the rituals, is to get you into that liminal flow state.
Yeah, I think it is and it isn't. It's to get into that state, because it's in that state that you can do the stuff with energy and with magic.
So when you're in a flow state, you won't actually think about being in a flow state. You'll only know if you were in a flow state post flow state.
Yeah, kind of retrospectively. If you suddenly go, oh yes, I've achieved flow, you're out of it, and you've got to try and work to get back into it. But yeah, it tends to be kind of retrospectively. You'd be like, oh yeah, that was just, and like I say, for a lot of people, it's, yeah, I think the phrase that most people use is in the zone. When you are in the zone, that's flow.
So in terms of, you know, what we're talking about, and in terms of ritual, the liminal state, in terms of flow, it's basically the same as the creative state that a lot of artists talk about.
Absolutely, and there's lots of overlap between kind of creative endeavors and practice. I mean, ritual practice.
Brilliant. Now, in terms of the one thing that you would like everybody to know about paganism, and the one thing that's incorrect, that, you know, the myth that gets perpetuated.
Yeah, so I maybe it's the elephant in the room because we haven't talked about it yet, but paganism is not devil worship. I think is one of the key things I would want people to know. And I, you know, because there's a whole thing around what Satanism is, for example. I think there are kind of different ways of understanding Satanism. Satanism can be a political kind of anti-establishment movement. It can be a religious practice that can involve witchcraft, but that is separate from paganism. There is no devil in the craft or in paganism. And so to suggest that pagans worship the devil is, it's kind of like asking Christians if they worship Hanuman. It's just not in that system. And so that would, I think, be the first thing, because there is an acknowledgement in paganism, because it's about nature worship. With that comes an acknowledgement that there is light and dark in nature and in us. You know, nature can be creative and destructive. You know, rivers give life, but they can also flood and take life away. And just as within us, we have darkness and we have light. And so, and we don't need to prefer one over the other either. Darkness, there can be a value in darkness. You know, righteous anger can be useful. And darkness doesn't necessarily have to be scary. You know, the womb is a dark space. And so darkness can be healing as well, that traveling inward to then travel back out. So I think that would be the key thing that I want people to think of. When they think of paganism, I'd rather the first thing they think of is nature worship than anything else.
And just, one other thing, just because Organic Boutique is an environmentally organic, sustainable brand, is we talk so much about paganism and nature worship. Is paganism inherently environmentalist?
I believe so. I think it would be very difficult to worship nature and to be environmentally irresponsible.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with?
No, I thank you for having me on. It's been wonderful to speak to you and to get the opportunity to make people more aware of paganism and what it is and what it involves.
Thank you, Charmaine. That was interesting. So thank you for joining me this week, and I look forward to have you join me next week when we talk about how to bring more magic, meaning, and well-being into the holidays. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.